Arizona Territory, 1878. The sun was high and merciless when Hattie Sumner hit the ground hard, shoved from the saddle by the man she had once called husband. "You made your choice," he muttered, dusting his hands like she was dirt. Then he turned, mounted his bay gelding, and rode off without looking back. She lay there stunned in the sand, dress torn at the shoulder, her mouth dry as bone. Heat rippled off the desert in waves, the only sound the whisper of wind through the mesquite. She scrambled to her feet, stumbling, dizzy, clutching her stomach. The canteen had gone with him. So had the food. So had her hope. He had promised her a fresh start, dragging her from Kansas to Arizona under the lie of gold, only to reveal his true nature once the land turned cruel. She had stayed too long, hoping he would change. Instead, he had left her here to die. The desert was wide, empty, and waiting. She walked until her legs gave, then crawled, then stopped. Time bled out with the light, and the sky turned a bruised red. Her lips cracked, her breath rattled. That was when the hoofbeats came. At first, she thought it was death riding toward her, but the figure that dismounted was tall, lean, with a tattered duster and a rifle slung across his back. He knelt beside her, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. "Hey," he said, voice low and steady. "You alive?" She blinked. "Water," she rasped. He did not hesitate. He pulled a metal flask from his saddlebag and tipped it to her lips, slow and careful. The water hit her tongue like salvation. "Name's Xander Sloan," he said softly. "You all right?" She coughed, then swallowed again. "Hattie." "Hattie Sumner." His eyes went hard for a second when he saw her torn dress and the bruises on her arms. He did not ask questions. Instead, he lifted her into his arms like she weighed nothing at all, carried her to his horse, and set her in the saddle. "You got anyone out here?" he asked. She shook her head weakly. He mounted behind her, steadying her with one arm. "Then you do now." His homestead sat 3 miles east of where he found her, tucked between a dry creek and a wind-warped juniper. It was not much: one room, one bed, a stove, a table, but it was clean, solid, safe. Xander set her down gently on the only cot, then lit the lantern. "Rest, I'll fix something." She tried to sit up. "I do not want to be trouble." "You are not," he said quickly. Then, quieter, "You've been through hell. You are safe here." He moved with quiet purpose, heating beans and coffee, setting a wet cloth to her forehead. She watched him from the bed, her eyes tracking his every move like she could not quite believe he was real. "Why did you help me?" she whispered. He looked over his shoulder, spoon in hand. "Because you needed help. No one else would have." He paused, then crossed the room and knelt beside her. "Well, I ain't no one else." She stared at him, breathing ragged. Her heart ached with something sharp and unfamiliar. He had no reason to bring her here, no reason to care. But he had. That night, she slept under a roof with a full belly and clean water in her cup, and for the first time in months, she was not afraid. By the second day, her strength had started to return. She stood shakily outside the cabin, holding onto the porch rail as she watched Xander chop wood. His shirt clung to his back with sweat, his arms sun dark and strong. He worked without looking at her, but she felt his awareness like a thread pulled tight between them. "I can help," she said. He set down the axe and turned. "You do not need to. I want to." He studied her for a beat, then nodded once. "All right." They moved around each other with quiet instinct. She cooked while he fixed the fence. She swept while he fetched water from the well. The silence between them grew warm, not cold. He never asked about her past, never pried, but his eyes saw everything. That night he found her outside, sitting on a rock, staring up at the stars. "You hungry?" he asked. She looked up at him, the moonlight catching her face. "Not for food." He sat beside her, boots crunching gravel. "Tell me what you need." She hesitated, then leaned just slightly against his shoulder. "This, just this." He did not move away, and neither of them spoke for a long time. By the 5th day, she laughed. It startled them both. Xander looked up from the corral, blinking like he had heard a ghost. "Did you just laugh?" Hattie covered her mouth, eyes shining. "I did not mean to." He grinned, wide and real. "Do it again." She did, soft and free. Later, while clearing the table, her hand brushed his. She froze, so did he. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, something slow and certain. He cleared his throat. "You sure you are all right staying here?" "I want to be nowhere else." He nodded, jaw tight. "Good." A week passed, then 2. She learned he had come from Texas after the war, trying to outrun ghosts of his own. He had lost a brother in the fighting and a girl who could not wait for him to come home. He had built this place with his hands and silence. "I thought I'd be alone forever," he said one night, voice low. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. "You are not." He looked at her like he had waited his whole life to hear that. One morning she woke to find a plate of biscuits and a note. "Back by sundown, stay warm." She smiled, fingers tracing the letters. His handwriting was rough but careful. Like him, when he returned, he had a basket in one hand and a wildflower tucked behind his ear. "For you," he said, handing both to her. She laughed, her heart full. "You picked flowers," he shrugged. "Seemed like the kind of thing a man should do." She stepped forward and pressed a kiss to his cheek. He went still, then he cupped her face and kissed her back, slow, steady, sure. That night he held her like she was something sacred. No rush, no demands, just quiet promises made in the dark. "I will never leave you," he whispered. She believed him, and she never stopped. By late March, the winds began to shift. The nights still bit, but the sun carried warmth now, and the mesquite trees near the creek pushed out tender green shoots. Hattie stood by the clothesline, pinning up a damp shirt of Xander's, her fingers stiff from wash water, her hair braided low. The scent of lye soap clung to her sleeves, and birds called from the chaparral beyond the ridge. Xander was in the north pasture, clearing mesquite roots with a mattock. She could hear the dull rhythm of iron against earth, steady as a heartbeat. She hadn't asked to stay past those first few days, but neither of them had spoken of her leaving, and the space between them had grown comfortable, like the slow settling of dust after rain. That evening she brought out a tin plate with cornbread and beans, setting it on the porch rail without a word. He was already sitting on the step, boots scuffed, jaw dark with stubble. He took the plate with a nod. "Had a letter come in last time I rode east," he said after a few bites. "From my sister back in Lampasas. Says frost ruined the peach trees." Hattie blinked. "You've a sister?" He took a sip of coffee, then nodded. "Two, Mabel and June. Mabel's the older one, raised us after Ma died. June was just a baby when Pa went missing in the war. Missing, never came back. No grave, just a letter from his captain and a trunk of his things." She tucked her skirt beneath her knees and sat beside him. "You ever think of going back?" He looked toward the darkening sky. "Used to. Thought maybe I'd build up enough here to bring him out west. But they've got kin there now. June married a wheelwright. Mabel teaches Sunday school. I send what I can." Hattie was quiet a moment. "They must miss you." "I reckon. But I ain't the same fella they knew. War and desert do things to a man." She didn't answer right away. The wind shifted slightly, bringing with it the scent of creosote and distant rain. "I used to sit by the window in the parlor and sew lace collars," she said slowly. "My husband would come in from the fields and I'd wait to see if he was sober. If he was, I got a kiss. If he wasn't, I got quiet." Xander set his cup down. "You don't have to, I want to." Her voice didn't tremble. "It wasn't always bad. He used to sing to me back when we were courting, had a voice like molasses, but when the land failed, he turned mean. I stayed because I thought I could fix it. Thought if I loved harder, he'd remember who he was before." Xander didn't look away. "You ain't to blame for what he chose." She nodded once, then looked out across the fading light. "He left me out there with nothing. I think he wanted to make sure I couldn't come back." "You did," Xander said, his voice low. "You walked out of that dust and didn't look back." When she glanced at him, his eyes met hers with a kind of quiet understanding that made her want to weep and lean into him all at once. Later, inside, she lit the lamp while he washed at the basin. The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't hollow. It was full of all the things neither of them had said in years, the kind of silence you could rest inside. He dried his hands slowly. "There's a dance in town come next Saturday." She turned from the lamp, surprised. "You go to dances?" "Not since I came here, but I got 2 shirts that ain't patched and you've got shoes now." Her chest tightened. "You want to go?" "I'd like to see you in lamplight that isn't mine." She laughed softly, the sound catching her off guard. "I'd have to borrow a ribbon from the widow east of the ridge. She's got a box full. Then I'll ride with you tomorrow." The next morning they set out early. The mule track was narrow, winding between Ocotillo and dry arroyos. Hattie rode pillion behind him, her arms around his waist, the steady rhythm of the horse beneath them. Dust rose behind them in lazy curls. The widow Mrs. Elmore lived in a clapboard house with blue curtains and a dog that barked until it saw Xander. She welcomed them with a cheerful fuss, pressing a button tin of trimmings into Hattie's hands. By the time they returned, the light was long and golden. Hattie sat at the kitchen table that evening, ribbon in hand, stitching it to the collar of her dress. Xander passed behind her to stoke the stove, his hand brushing her shoulder just once. Neither of them spoke the words sitting between them. They didn't have to. That night she dreamt of music and open doors, of a room lit by lanterns and a man watching her from across the floor. When she woke, Xander was already outside, splitting kindling, and the smell of coffee drifted through the cabin window. She rose, tied her hair back, and stepped into the day. The dust rolled off the mesa in soft gusts as Xander adjusted the collar of his cleanest shirt, the one with 2 missing buttons near the hem. He'd shaved that morning beside the well with water that bit like ice, the mirror propped on a wooden post. His hands had trembled just enough to nick the edge of his jaw, and he'd muttered under his breath, not from pain, but from nerves he hadn't felt in years. Inside the cabin, Hattie laced her boots with quiet precision. The borrowed ribbon threaded through her hair, pale blue like cornflowers after rain. The dress she wore hung a little loose at the waist, but she'd cinched it with a strip of muslin and stitched the hem by lanternlight the night before. She hadn't worn a dress like that since Kansas. Her fingers found the edge of the fabric now, smoothing it once, then twice. "You ready?" he asked when she stepped outside. She nodded, but her voice caught before it reached her lips. Instead, she held his gaze for a moment longer than she had to. They rode into town as the sun dipped low, the trail bathed in amber light. The horse moved steady beneath them, and the silence between them held something faintly electric. Town came into view slow, a few storefronts, lamplight spilling from windows, dust curling beneath wagon wheels. The schoolhouse had been cleared for the dance, and a fiddler sat on the porch tuning his strings while folks in their Sunday best trickled in. Xander dismounted and offered his hand. She took it. Her gloves were worn thin at the fingertips, but her grip was sure. Inside, lanterns hung from rafters, casting a warm haze over the room. A girl played a reel on the fiddle while her younger brother beat time on a wooden box. The floorboards creaked under boots and laughter. Hattie lingered near the wall, watching a pair of older women slice peach pie onto tin plates. A boy with a crooked tooth offered her a cup of cider and skittered away before she could thank him. "You don't have to dance," Xander said, standing beside her. "We can just sit and watch." "I want to," she said. Her voice didn't shake this time, but I've forgotten how. "I haven't danced in 10 years, he replied. "We'll be even." They stepped onto the floor during a slow waltz. He placed his hand carefully at her waist. Her fingers found his shoulder. They moved with quiet awkwardness at first, their boots lagging behind the rhythm, but then something shifted. Her body remembered the shape of the music, and his steadied into hers. "You always this patient?" she asked softly. He looked down at her. "Only with you." When the music stopped, they didn't step apart right away. The fiddler paused to retune, and the room filled with the rustle of skirts and the scrape of chairs. Hattie's cheeks were flushed, not from heat but from something deeper, something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. They left the dance early, walking the horse instead of riding. The moon was high by then, casting silver across the trail. The wind had quieted and the world felt still. "I used to think I'd never be anything but someone's burden," she said after a long stretch of silence. Xander stopped walking. "You're not," she looked up at him. "You didn't know me when you brought me back." "No," he said, "but I knew you had fight left." That was enough. They reached the cabin close to midnight. He held the door for her, then waited as she lit the lamp. The flame caught, flickering against the walls. The warmth of the room pressed in around them, and Hattie turned to face him. "I don't want to leave," she said. "You don't have to," she stepped closer. "I've been waiting for the other shoe to drop, for this to vanish like the rest." "It won't," he said, his voice steady. "Not unless you walk away from it. I'm not going anywhere." He didn't kiss her then. He simply reached for her hand and brought it to his chest, laying it over his heartbeat. That night she lay beside him for the first time, her head tucked beneath his chin, their hands still clasped. There were no promises spoken aloud, but they didn't need them. The desert had taken much from them both, but it had given them this. By early April, the creek near Xander's land had begun to run again, thin and cold from snowmelt in the distant mountains. Hattie stood barefoot on the bank one morning, her hem lifted in one hand, the other holding a tin pail. The water numbed her ankles, but she didn't move. Morning birds flitted through the prickly branches overhead, and the sky stretched clean and wide above her. When she returned to the cabin, Xander was seated on the porch mending the girth strap on his saddle, a needle clenched between his teeth. He looked up when she approached, his gaze flicking to the pail in her hand, then to her feet. "You'll catch cold." I wanted to feel something colder than the wind for once. He set the leather aside. I could have gone. I needed the quiet. He didn't press. Instead, he stood and took the pail, setting it near the door. "You want to come with me to the east line after breakfast? A few of the posts buckled in the last storm." She nodded, brushing a strand of wet hair behind her ear. "I'll pack bread and salt pork." They rode out side by side, the mare shifting easily beneath her now. She'd grown steadier in the saddle, though she still kept one hand close to the horn. The trail to the fence line ran along a dry ridge scattered with rabbit brush and flint rock. Xander led her to a sun-bleached post that leaned at a crooked angle, the wire slack. He knelt beside it and began digging out the old base with a spade. Hattie crouched beside him, passing stones aside. After a while, he paused and leaned back on his heels. "A man came through here once. Last spring. Said he was looking for a brother who'd gone missing after the war, had a letter and a name, but nothing else." She wiped her hands on her skirt. "Did you know the name?" "I did, but it wasn't someone I could help him find." She looked at him carefully. "You knew him, knew of him." "He deserted, disappeared into the hills, and never came back. Folks don't talk about him much now." "Did you say anything to the brother?" "No, figured he came for peace, not truth." They worked in silence after that, the new post driven deep, the wire drawn taut. When it was done, they sat in the shade of a boulder, sharing a strip of dried apple and a swallow of water from his canteen. Hattie glanced sideways at him. "You ever think about what you'd have done different?" He let the question settle. "Sometimes I figure I'd have left Texas sooner. Spent fewer years trying to make something out of scorched ground." She nodded. "I used to think I'd have married someone different. But then I wonder if that version of me, the girl who said yes to him, would have ever survived out here." He looked at her then, not with pity, but with something steadier. "You did more than survive." She didn't answer, but her fingers brushed his and the contact was soft and sure. That evening, she boiled beans over the stove while he carved a new handle for the draw knife. The window was open, the breeze carrying the scent of sage. She turned from the pot, drying her hands on a cloth. "Xander," she said, "what would it mean to start something new? Not just surviving, but choosing something." He set the knife down slowly. "It'd mean both of us saying yes with the same breath." She stepped closer, her voice low. "I want to say it." He stood, the space between them folding in like a page turned. He didn't reach for her, he waited. "I will never ask you to hide what's come before," he said, "but I'll stand beside you every day after." She touched his chest, just above his heart. "Then we're agreed." That night they lay beneath the stars on a blanket beside the cabin, the fire burning low nearby. She rested against him, his arm beneath her shoulders, her hand linked with his. They didn't speak of the past again. They didn't need to. The wind brushed over them like a benediction, and when the fire burned down to embers, they rose together and went inside home. The days mellowed as spring deepened. By the time the ocotillo bloomed in bright red flares along the creek, Hattie had sewn curtains for the cabin windows and patched Xander's second-best shirt with a spare piece of calico she'd traded for from Mrs. Elmore. The rhythm of their life had settled into something quiet, but whole mornings spent tending the land, evenings shared over small meals, and sleep that came easy beside each other. One afternoon, Hattie sat cross-legged on the cabin floor, sorting through a small chest of things she'd brought west, items she hadn't looked at since Xander carried her from the desert. A folded photograph of her younger brother, faded and soft at the edges. a tin thimble from her mother's sewing basket, and a half-finished sampler from before her wedding, the thread still bright but the pattern half-formed. She held it up as Xander came in from the corral, brushing dust from his sleeves. "I never finished this," she said. He crouched beside her, studying the stitches. What was it going to be? A verse from the Book of Ruth. I never got far enough to finish the words. He reached for her hand, thumb passing over her knuckles. You could now. She folded the cloth carefully. Maybe. I think I'd rather start something new. That evening, as they shelled peas by lantern light, Xander glanced at her, fingers working slow. I've been thinking on the north field, he said. Ground's rocky, but if we cleared it proper, we might get barley in by July. She looked up from her bowl. You want to plant together? I want to build a life with you, that's part of it. She set the bowl down, the lantern light catching the curve of her cheek. You sure? He nodded. I don't need a preacher's words to know what's right. But if you'd want to stand before a circuit rider, I'd ride to Bisbee tomorrow. Her eyes didn't leave his. I would. They rode out 3 days later with the sun at their backs and a packed saddlebag of bread, jerky, and a bottle of blackberry cordial misses. Elmore pressed into Hattie's hands with a wink and a prayer. The trail climbed through low hills and past mining camps, rough-sounding men nodding from the shade of canvas tents. Xander kept a steady hand on the reins, but his other always found its way to hers. They reached Bisbee near sundown, dusted and hungry. A lean man with a crooked collar and a hymn book married them beneath the porch overhang of the general store. No pews, no music, just the wind, the man's solemn words, and the way Xander looked at her when he spoke her name. They stayed that night in a small room above the feed store, the mattress lumpy but the windows open wide to the stars. Hattie laid beside him, the ring he'd traded for glinting faintly in the moonlight. I ain't never had much, he said, brushing her hair back. But every good thing I got now, I got because of you. She touched his chest over the place where his heart beat steady. I want to grow old here, beside you. With land we work together and quiet nights like this. He kissed her then, not with urgency, but with the kind of certainty that doesn't fade. They returned home the next morning, the trail dusty and long but their silence full of ease. That spring they cleared the north field together. Her hands blistered, his back ached, but the rows straightened beneath their care. They planted barley by the new moon, and by midsummer, pale green shoots rose from the soil like promise. Children from nearby homesteads came to visit with baskets of eggs and jars of pickled beets. Mrs. Elmore taught Hattie how to preserve peaches. Xander built a second room onto the cabin using salvaged pine and his own measured patience. On Sundays, they sat together on the porch. Sometimes they read from the worn copy of Whitman's Leaves of Grass that had belonged to Xander's brother. Sometimes they just watched the light roll across the hills. One evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long, Hattie set her sewing aside and looked up from the rocker. Do you ever miss what you left behind? He shook his head slowly. No. It's all ahead now. She rose, crossed the porch, and stepped into his arms. The breeze carried the scent of sun-warmed earth and barley just beginning to ripen. He held her close, her cheek against his shoulder. You're my whole world, she whispered. He kissed the top of her head. And you're mine. The seasons turned, the barley ripened, golden and thick. Xander built a windbreak near the creek. Hattie started a garden with beans, squash, and marigolds. They didn't need much, just the land, the sky, each other. And every night, without fail, he reached for her hand before sleep. They never let go.